Okay, so we started out sort of in the periphery. Well, we started out on the cellular level, but we started out in the periphery, and we've sort of been working our way in, and we're finally getting to the brain and the cerebrum. So the first part of this, we're going to be talking about the diencephalon, which is really sort of tucked in the middle underneath the cerebrum. So it's an important area of the brain. So for the learning objectives, I want you to be able to list the basic functions, general locations, and disorders, if any. There's some of the areas we're going to talk about that really don't have any disorders, but if there is a disorder that we talk about, I want you to be able to list that, of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, and the subthalamus. So you may have figured out just from this list that the diencephalon includes anything with the word thalamus in it. So I also want you to be able to generally describe the composition and basic functions of subcortical white matter. So as we know, white matter is white because it's heavily myelinated, and things in the brain that are heavily myelinated are axons, and axons are carrying information from one place to another. So really that's pretty basic description of subcortical white matter, but we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. The diencephalon, like I said earlier, includes all structures with the term thalamus in their names. So in this picture, you see the thalamus is the little egg-shaped part that's right at the center of the brain. And we've talked about how when you're with sensation, in order for us to be aware of any sensation, it has to go through the thalamus. So the thalamus receives information from everything. It receives information from the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and all of the sensory systems, except the olfactory system. That's the only sensory system that doesn't go through the thalamus, which I think that's really interesting. I don't know why. Maybe that's why smell is so intertwined with memory, but all of the sensory systems go through the thalamus except olfactory. So the other areas in the diencephalon are named for their location relative to the thalamus. They're not named, they don't have thalamus in their name because they have a similarity of function to the thalamus. They're just named by their location relative to the thalamus. Make sense? So the thalamus itself consists of nuclei, which are groups of neurons. The individual thalamic nuclei are three main functional groups, and I'm not going to expect you to know the individual thalamic nuclei. But the relay nuclei convey information from the sensory system, except olfactory, and the basal ganglia and the cerebellum to the cerebral cortex. So that's easy to remember. They relay that information from other areas to the cerebral cortex. The association nuclei process emotional and some memory information, or they integrate different types of sensation. So a lot of processing goes on in the thalamus. Non-specific nuclei, this like miscellaneous nuclei, regulate consciousness, arousal, and attention. So lots going on in the thalamus. Thalamic lesions, if they interrupt those ascending pathways that are coming from the somatosensory system, then they eliminate contralateral sensation, because in order to be aware of sensation, it has to be passed by the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So if those lesions interrupt ascending pathways, then we're not going to know about that sensation. Proprioception is most affected by thalamic lesions. We don't have to worry about what happens in the intralaminar nuclei, but it's obviously an important area because it produces moderate to severe disability or even a vegetative state. So obviously those nuclei are the ones that are involved with awareness and consciousness and arousal. In Parkinson's disease, a thalamic stroke, or a traumatic brain injury are the most frequent causes of lesions that affect those intralaminar nuclei and produce those severe disabilities. So one of the disabilities that you'll see from a thalamic stroke is known as lateropulsion, and you will learn more about this in your neurorehab lab in class next quarter, and also what to do if you're working with somebody who has it. And lateropulsion is actually a powerful pushing away from the less paretic side in sitting, during transfers, standing, or walking. So you're actually pushing to the weaker side, which you can understand that really creates a high risk for falls. So they extend the non-paralyzed arm and push, and also with the leg, and you're pushing onto the weaker side. So they think that lateropulsion is a response to a specific deficit in sensing postural alignment relative to gravity due to a lesion of the posterior thalamus. So it causes spatial inattention or possibly a lesion in the medulla that affects the vestibular nuclei. Again, causing a deficit in being able to sense your postural alignment relative to gravity. So for most people, this resolves within about 6 months, but it can be a really dangerous thing while they're doing it. So there are some different strategies you can use in working with people with lateropulsion, and you will learn those next quarter. So the hypothalamus, it's named for its location right below the thalamus. Hypo is below. And so you can see in this picture, there's the thalamus, the hypothalamus right below it. It is essential for individual and species survival because it integrates behaviors with visceral functions. So if you stimulate the hypothalamus, and they usually do this type of research in animals. You don't usually stimulate a person's hypothalamus. It causes the animal to search for and ingest food as long as the stimulation is applied. So obviously the hypothalamus is important for food-seeking behaviors, eating behaviors. If they destroy bilaterally the areas associated with eating behaviors, it will cause the animal to refuse food, even when the animal will starve, even if they're sitting right in front of a bowl of food. Because without that impulse from the hypothalamus, we have no desire to eat. So lots of functions orchestrated by the hypothalamus, maintaining homeostasis. So remember, the hypothalamus is one of the areas with the leaky blood-brain barrier because it's sampling the blood, saying like, oh, what's my blood sugar like? Do I need to eat? What are my other blood chemicals like? So it functions in maintaining homeostasis. It also tests the temperature of the blood and sees if it needs to change the metabolism. It involves controlling eating, reproductive, and defensive behaviors. It controls the emotional expression of pleasure, rage, fear, and aversion. And those are all very sort of basic emotions. It's involved in the regulation of circadian rhythms in concert with other brain regions. It's involved in the endocrine regulation of growth, metabolism, and reproductive organs. So these are all very basic functions. The hypothalamus is a survival tool. That is really what the hypothalamus is all about. The epithalamus is involved with the pineal gland. The pineal gland is one of the major structures in the epithalamus, and it's believed to regulate circadian rhythms and influence the secretions of the pituitary gland, the adrenal and the parathyroid glands, and the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas, which secrete insulin. So the epithalamus obviously very involved in metabolism, hormone secretion, and circadian rhythms. The subthalamus is located superior to the substantia nigra of the midbrain. So it's sort of right in between the thalamus and the substantia nigra. It's part of the basal ganglia circuit, and it's involved in regulating movement. So it facilitates some of the output from basal ganglia nuclei. So in the next section, we'll talk about subcortical white matter.